Welcome to the Real Bible Rob podcast. If we want to decolonize Christianity, then we must take a look at it again and where it comes from. Because in order to free ourselves from Christian nationalism, to help people grow spiritually in a new and modern faith, we have to get rid of some of the baggage that we have in order to look at a more open and modern Christianity. Because, frankly, most of the theologies that we have, in particular around Augustine, Anselm, Calvin, and so forth, are deeply anti-Semitic, and they have a background in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance that we really have to just kind of take another look at. So my proposal is that in order to really understand where the faith is going and to decolonize it, you have to take a deep look at Romans 3. And Romans 3 is particularly important because this is where what Calvin especially used as the basis for the doctrine of total depravity, which is, the utter debasement of humanity, and penal substitutionary atonement, which came from it. And, I'm not an anti-Calvin person. I know it sounds like it, but I'm very critical of Calvinism and what came out of it and its project, because Calvin was a man of the 1530s through 1580s, and served a very important purpose in updating theology at that time. But here we are 500 years later, and we're still fighting over it, and we still use the resulting Calvinism that came out of it, again, in a very anti-Semitic, very racist, very colonialist background, and we're still using it, and we're still fighting these battles today. A very important aspect of understanding Romans 3 is to understand what Yom Kippur is. If we look at Paul's argument as part of about Yom Kippur, very Jewish way of looking at it, which Paul is doing, then it really helps us to decolonize these passages and can give us a different way of looking at atonement and so forth. One of the things that's absolutely critical when you really look at Romans and you look at it deeply, you have to understand that there's a grand argument here. And especially in earlier chapters, Romans 3 through Romans 7 or so, Paul is using an imaginary argument or argument against an imaginary person. And that person is called the interlocutor by scholars. And this is Paul's straw man that he's fighting against. And he's taking extreme forms of this argument back and forth with this. And this is Paul's famous phrase, by no means, or in Greek, it's meganeto. Meganeto means absolutely not. And Paul says it over and over in Romans. In fact, it can be rather humorous as you go through. He keeps coming, absolutely not. Whenever he does that, what he's doing is he's comparing one argument with another. And that gets lost completely in a lot of modern readings of Romans, especially when you cherry pick out and pull out certain passages, which gets done. This is exactly what Calvin did with Romans 3:10 through 18, which is used for total depravity, and then he did it again in 324 through 26 or so, which is the basis for penal substitutionary atonement. This idea is what he did in both cases, and what we still do today, and we do in lots of theology. So I'm not going to blame just Calvin. It's like all theologians do this, is they'll take one side of the argument and they'll base their theology on one side of the argument, which Paul didn't mean for it to be used this way. And when we use it and understand what he's talking about and how he used this argument, it really helps us. And I think it really gives us an opportunity to decolonize the theology, to decolonize Christianity honestly, and start looking at it a lot more honestly. So let's get started with these two sections here. Many people think that Romans 3:10 through 18, which starts with, "There is no one who is righteous, not even one," as total depravity. And in fact, you can see the polemic is really strong in here, and you can read the whole thing. But the idea is that Paul is picking from numerous places in the Old Testament. He picks from Ecclesiastes 7:20, Psalm 5, Psalm 14, Psalm 53, Psalm 140. He sprinkles in a little bit of Proverbs 1. He adds a little bit of Isaiah 59. And you go, wait a minute. He's citing all of these different verses. He's picking them up, little pieces of them, verbatim, just to create 9 verses in Romans 3. And you go, well, he's cherry picking. He's doing what we rail against. We say you have to read the whole Bible, you have to understand all of the scripture. No, Paul is cherry picking. And this is where one of my favorite scholars who can really help us with this is Amy Jill Levine, and she's a Jewish scholar of the New Testament from Vanderbilt University. So she has this background and faith that gives her the ability to see both sides of Paul's argument, written in the way that Paul meant it to be read. And she says about these verses, about 10 through 18. Paul cites these verses from various books to illustrate his point. Paul must have been aware of the contrary passages around these citations, or among these citations, that indicate the speaker's devotion to righteousness and claim to live accordingly. So Levine is talking about the interlocutor and the hypothetical righteous person in the argument. And then she continues, Paul's argument should not be universalized, but understood as a polemical diatribe against his hypothetical accuser. In other words, one side of the argument. The trouble comes, and this is where I look at this and I go, well, this is exactly what Calvin and many of the church theologians and reformers did, is they took one side of the argument. They just took these 9 verses and created a whole theology around it. They universalized it in the way that Amy Jill Levine says you shouldn't, and that was not meant by Paul. And what we've done is we've created a theology of the utter worthlessness of humanity, that there is no value, complete debasement of the value of human intention and the worth of human intention. There's no value whatsoever in human endeavor, according to this view. And but that's not Paul's argument. Paul's argument is that sin exists and that we are equal under the law because all people are slaves to sin. And that part of giving up on that slavery to sin, giving up on that we can take the character of sin, which he talks about in Romans 6, and we can replace that. And Paul's argument is that we replace that with Christ. We replace sin and death with Christ and life or resurrection. This is often called Christus Victor, and became a very popular way to look at atonement over the centuries. And even today in Eastern Orthodox theology, it's central, this idea. It's much more what Paul is trying to do. He's saying that sin is and it's kind of a Greek philosophy way of looking at it too, kind of a dualism thing, is that sin versus and death versus Christ and life. That's what he's saying. That it's part of the package of being human. That all people, all people seek advantage. All people have selfish motives. All people become consumed with jealousy and hate from time to time, and that. But we also have a loving nature. We have good intentions. We have righteousness. So, what Paul is doing in going back to the Old Testament in this argument is that he's picking the bad stuff to argue against. See how it's used so dishonestly. It just drives me insane when I hear, especially, really strict, tulip type 5-point Calvinists come and say, well, yeah, Paul, absolutely believes in total depravity and the utter debasement of human worth, essentially. That our only worth is what God gives us and what, in the fact that God redeems us in Jesus. And, okay, I suppose you could say that, but what that does is that puts a domineering God and a God who stands back watching us fail, and that we're headed to hell without the choice of God. So that's Calvinism, right? And that's a strict form of Calvinism. But you got to understand why this is so problematic. It is deeply anti-Semitic because Paul's argument is, and then if we skip forward to especially verses 25 and 26, this is where we get this idea of propitiation. Now, propitiation is, and I've spoken about this before, but it's in this context, propitiation is the appeasement of God, and the appeasement of God through sacrifice. And the idea that it's an exchange, you've got to do one for another. And this propitiation becomes the exchange of Christ for us in punishment. And that, of course, is the base of penal substitutionary atonement. But that ignores what is really said, because the word for propitiation is not what it is. It really should be a place of atonement, or the Hiiasterion. Hiiasterion in Greek really refers to the mercy seat and the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement is Yom Kippur. This is the one day of the year when the blood of sacrifice was sprinkled on the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant, and that was a ritual that covered the sins, became the cover for sin for the Israelites for the year. When Paul's referring to the Hiiasterion here, he's not talking about propitiation or substitution at all. What he's talking about is the covering of sin, the replacement of sin and death with Christ and life. This is, and his diatribe against depravity is one in saying that we all need it, that we are equal under whether we have the law or not, whether we have the law in our hearts, as he says about the Gentiles in Romans 2:15, or whether we have the explicit written law that the Jews had. It doesn't matter, because all of us are in need of this covering for sin. We're all in need of Yom Kippur. That's what he's saying. And it's a very Jewish thing. But for whatever reason, well, I think because of domination and wanting to dominate other people, and saying that Christianity is the one way, the certain kind of Christianity that Calvin was pushing, to get away from the Catholic Church, he is saying that it's a replacement, a substitution. And you have to read Hebrews in a very specific way in order to get that substitutionary type idea. Like I said, if you're Eastern Orthodox, you don't believe in this. You really, if you're Catholic, you sort of don't believe in penal substitution. You believe more in scapegoat and in Anselm than you do in penal substitutionary atonement, which is very much a Calvinist, very much of a Protestant theory of atonement. So not even all Christians can't even agree what this is. But the one thing that we should agree is that Paul, in this argument, is not saying that only one side, is not misusing the Old Testament like the systematic theologians do. Paul is also not ignoring the fact that Yom Kippur, and what that means, that Yom Kippur is what Jesus does. Jesus is the Hiiasterion. So rather than it replacing or substituting, that Jesus is the one that God refers to as the mercy seat, the cover for sin. It's a much healthier way to look at it, in my view. One of the things that happens from this is we have developed, especially in Reformed theology and Calvinist type theologies, we have developed an image of God that's punitive, that God requires appeasement, kind of like the gods of old, where you had to do human sacrifice for. You had to do, you had to bring your gifts to God to keep God from punishing you. And Paul's argument is that that's no longer valid. You don't have to do that anymore. That if everything's about God standing back with his arms folded, and that Jesus is the one that takes God's wrath away, all Paul's argument is that doesn't apply. The older ways don't apply to us anymore. That we don't have to look at God as somebody who needs to be appeased, and in this shaming way. But rather, Paul is talking about Yom Kippur, which means redemption and protection. And it's and the mercy seat allows the people to be in a redeemed state rather than every single sin, every single thing that goes wrong, that there's a scorecard being kept. Now, Beverly Roberts Gaventa, who is my favorite Roman scholar by far, firmly states that there's strong linguistic evidence that we need to look at Hiiasterion as the mercy seat, that Christ is the metaphor of the Hiiasterion in Christ means the mercy seat, the place of redemption, not just some sort of cosmic exchange. That the mercy seat becomes redemption and protection for all. And I think that this really helps us, because if we look at it in this way, a faith in God, it means that we'll see God as a companion by our side, suffering with us, rather than our opponent. And this is a very much of a part of Christianity that we have to expunge. This idea of God as opponent, as demanding punishment, demanding damnation if his wrath isn't satisfied. This is a very domineering thing, and I believe that that's why it's perpetuated, and that's why it's become so much a part of colonialism, right? Because what is colonialism? It's the domination of a superior race of people over inferior people, and that people from Europe could go around the world, feel superior to the people that they were subjugating, and saying, we will save you through us. We know the truth. We know We have this substitutionary atonement theology. We'll impose it on you, and you can see that it's very hierarchical in that way, and which is anti-gospel, because I think, it's very clear, it's anti-Paul, because Paul says over and over and over again that there is no Jew, there is no Greek, there is no man, there's no woman, there's no free, nor is there slave in God's eyes. That this hierarchy, this dominating force, imposing the will on lesser people or inferior people, which is what colonialism is. Superior people enforcing and imposing their will on inferior people. Isn't the gospel. Isn't what Paul's saying. It's anti-gospel. So this is why we have to get out of this mode, I think, in order to move forward. We have to just get out of the mode of thinking that there's superior people and inferior people, because that's against what Paul's message is here. It's against Romans. Romans sets us free from the power of sin, from the slavery of sin. That means getting out of this mode of saying, I'm better than you. It's really that simple. So with that, I'll say, people say lots of things about the Bible that aren't really there. And this is probably the prime motivator for me to do this podcast, to do my ministry, honestly, is to help people get out of this mode of thinking that there's superior people and inferior people. To get out of this mode of imposing will on others. Get out of this mode of that a lot of evangelists have, really, is perpetuating colonialism. That's what evangelism is in a lot of people's minds. It's the continuation of colonialism. Let's get away from that. And like I said, I think one of the best ways to get away from that is to look at Romans 3 critically and understanding it in terms of Paul's use of argument and Paul's vision and use of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. I think that can really save us a lot of heartache and give us a positive faith that people can move forward with. So with that, I say thank you so much for listening, and God bless you.